Hey everyone, this is Rick from In Front of IT. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be going over an install of Portainer on Ubuntu. Portainer is a graphical interface, web-based, to allow you to manage Docker. In a previous video, I went over a Docker install on Ubuntu. So if you don't have Docker installed, you can refer to that video to do an install and then come back to this one. But Portainer allows you through a graphical user interface to be able to fully manage Docker, create new containers, manage old ones, restart them, stop them, change configuration settings, as well as being able to troubleshoot containers. You can check the logs of containers. You can go into the shell of containers and run commands and test for files, make config changes, things like that. Now, you can do all this from the command line, but Docker has a lot of commands, and sometimes they're hard to remember. So for a home lab, running some testing, using Portainer to manage your containers in Docker is a lot easier and straightforward. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get in front of it. So the first thing we're going to do, as we usually do, is do an update and then an upgrade of the OS using the apt command. So we're going to go through that using sudo, running sudo apt update, and then followed by sudo apt upgrade to install the packages. After the upgrade completes, to be on the safe side, you might want to reboot your OS, but I didn't do that here. There was no need. Next up, we're going to verify that Docker is installed by running the docker ps-a command. If you recall, that command will show you all containers running or stopped that are installed on your Docker system. If you don't have Docker installed, if you get an error, command not found, or you know for sure you haven't installed Docker, look in the description below. I'll have the link there for the other video that I have on how to install Docker on Ubuntu. So as you can see here, we run the docker ps-a command and it's showing a hello world container. So that verifies that Docker is installed. And just to make sure that Docker is actually working and can run containers, I'm going to go ahead and type in the docker run hello world command to run a hello world container and verify that Docker is working. And as you can see from the output, you do have Docker installed correctly. So next step, let's go ahead and install Portainer. So with Portainer, it needs to actually store its data somewhere. It has a small database and some other configuration files that will persist if the container is stopped or restarted. It will look for that data on a restart. And you specify what that directory is where it stores and retrieves that data in the command line you use with Docker to actually run the container. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and make the directory. Now, you can make that directory anywhere on the system. In this case, since this is a personal machine that I use for testing with Ubuntu, I'm going to go ahead and make it in my home directory. So you do an LL first, just to show you what's in the home directory, and then we're going to go ahead and type make dir and the name of the directory. And in this case, I'm calling the directory Portainer_data, and I'm putting it right in the home directory. And I'm running another LL command just to make sure it was created correctly. And I'll go ahead and highlight it, but as you can see, the directory is created. Next up is to actually run the command that will install and start the Portainer container. The command will be in the description. The command uses docker run and specifies some parameters to install the Portainer container. Some of these parameters might be self-explanatory, but I'll go over them anyway. First, we have the -d, which tells Docker to run the container in the background, meaning that it will start the container and come right back to the command line, basically running it as a process under Docker in the background and not taking up your command line. That's the typical way you want to start containers when you're not running them interactively, but you want to run them, let's say, as you would a service or a daemon process. The next two parameters with the -p are basically telling Docker what ports on the host to map to the ports on the container. And we have 8000 and 9443. I don't recall what 8000 is used for, to be honest, but it is well documented in Portainer on the website. But 9443 is the web interface that we'll be connecting to over SSL. Next parameter we have is -- restart equals always. That should be self-explanatory. Basically, always start up the container if it stopped. Next is the name. And the next one is -v, which is mapping a volume. Now this one is important. What this option is doing is mapping the docker.sock, which is the file-based interprocess or IPC interface that is exposed on the host for processes to communicate and talk to Docker directly. So that is getting mapped into the Portainer container and will allow Portainer to manage the Docker instance on the host. The next option with -v is also an important one. That's the one I mentioned before, where the data for the Portainer container, the persistent data like the database, the config, admin passwords, things like that, will be mapped into the container. And the last one, Portainer/Portainer-CE, is the actual image that is pulled from the Docker registry. I'm not specifying a version here, we're just leaving it blank, and by default, when it doesn't have a version, it uses latest. Now, since this is a test system, we can do that, but in a production environment with Docker, I would never recommend that. You'd always want to use a version so you can control what versions your containers use. But since this is for a local development environment or local test environment, leaving it blank is fine. Once we hit enter, Docker's going to realize it doesn't have a copy of the Portainer container image locally, so it's going to go ahead and pull it from the Docker registry. And assuming no issues or problems, it should just return you to the command prompt after a long GUI ID pops up. After it's done, let's go ahead and run the docker ps command and verify that the container is running. And as you can see, it is. Running the docker ps command will show you the container ID, which is the start of that long GUID ID that showed up in the last command, and other information such as the image name, the ports that the container is listening on, as well as the name of the container at the end. So we're going to go ahead and open up our browser and try to access the Portainer website. So let's type in http localhost, and remember we're using the port 9443 for the website. Okay, yeah, that's right. It's listening on SSL, which is encrypted, so we have to use HTTPS, not HTTP. So let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see, we get a warning about a potential security risk. All this is the fact that the certificate we're using is a self-signed certificate created by the Portainer container. So it's not going to be recognized by your browser. Go ahead and let me know in the comments if you would like me to tell you how to set up a valid certificate for your Portainer container. But in the case of this, since we're just using it for testing, this should be fine. We're going to go ahead and click on advanced. And as you can see, it shows the error of the self-signed cert. And just clicking on the certificate, you can see that it is a certificate, a self-signed certificate. So we'll go ahead and click accept the risk and continue. Once you do that, you'll get into the website. And since this is the first time that you're logging into Portainer, it's going to allow you to actually create the password for the admin account. So they recommend or provide a as they say, securely generated password, which is just a random alphanumeric password, or you can type in your own. So I'm going to go ahead and type in my own password here. I'm also going to uncheck the allow connection of anonymous statistics. I'm only doing that because this is an actual test environment, but it's purely up to you whether you want to leave that on or not. That basically allows the Portainer company to collect data from your Portainer instance that they use for metrics collection, improvement of the application, etc. After unchecking that, we'll go ahead and click on Create User. Once you click on Create User, you should be in the Portainer interface. We can click on Get Started. And once you click on that, you should see your local Docker instance, which is the instance running on the same Ubuntu machine we set this up on. And it'll show some summary information of what's going on there. As you can see with mine, it's showing that Docker is running. It's showing that there's 3 containers. It's also showing the footprint of the system, 4 CPU and 3 gigabytes of RAM, and 2 images. The nice thing about Portainer is you can actually have it as a central setup managing multiple Docker instances, not just one. In this case, we only have one here. So we're going to go ahead and click on it to drill down on that Docker instance. Once you do that, you see it shows the same information that was on the central dashboard. If we click on containers, it'll show the containers that are installed, similar to the docker ps-a command from the command line. It'll show you the general information, whether they're running or not, the actual image name, what ports it's listening on, as well as what image they're pulled from and when they were created. And it'll show you the status. In this case, I have 2 Hello World containers that I ran. Those showing exited, which means they ran and then they stopped, or they were terminated. And the current Portainer container itself that's currently running. Clicking on images on the left nav bar will show you the actual images you have installed and the size and when they were created. It'll also show you what the image is. So in this case, I have 2 images, Hello World, latest, which means it's the Hello World image from the Docker repository, and it's the latest version. The one below that is the Portainer CE container from the Docker repository and also the latest version. From here, you can manage images, delete them, remove them. It's not showing up here, but if an image is not used, it will show a tag saying unused. And that allows you to be able to prune unused images, delete them, and keep your Docker instance running light. Next up, as I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do a maintenance of the Portainer instance from the command line. That is upgrading Portainer or changing it to the latest version, downgrading it to a previous version if you needed to do that for some reason, etc. So first up, I'm just going to go ahead and rename the Docker instance from local to Ubuntu testing. You can name it whatever you want, it's purely optional. Since we used the restart always option when we created the container, Docker will always start up this container automatically. I'm going to show you that. We're going to do a reboot of the Ubuntu OS, and you'll see that the container will come back up on its own once the system is rebooted. So we're going to start up terminal and run the docker ps command. And as you can see, once we hit enter, you see that the Portainer container is running, and it's been up about a minute since the system was rebooted. It shows the same information as before. Ports it's listening on, image version, container ID. And starting up the Firefox browser and going back into the Portainer website, you can see that it's running. So on this system, both Docker and Portainer are set up to start up automatically once the system starts up. For the last part of this video, I'm going to show you how to do an upgrade of Portainer, or even a downgrade if needed, from the command line. So going back to our terminal, the first thing we're going to do is stop the Portainer instance with the command docker stop container. Once you see it respond with the container name, you know that Docker has stopped it. And we'll confirm that by typing in the docker ps command, and you see that there are no containers running right now. And if you type in the docker ps-a command, remember -a is for all, you see that the Docker container is there, but it was stopped about 10 seconds ago. Next step will be removing the Portainer container. But before we do that, let's just take a look and make sure or see where the actual data for the Portainer instance is stored. So in our home directory, if you recall when we ran the command, we do an ll and Portainer_data is the directory where the Portainer information is stored. So if we do that, we see that the data is there. So now the next step is to remove the Portainer container. We do that by running docker rm Portainer. Again, Docker will respond with the container name to verify that the container was removed. And as you see, we run docker ps-a, and we do not see the Portainer container anymore. All we're seeing is our hello world container from a previous test. Let's make sure our data is still there on the system. Data for Portainer, that is. We'll do that by running the ll Portainer_data command again. And as you can see, the data is still there. So we're good. The final step is to recreate the Portainer container. And we do that by running the same command we ran when we created it the first time. The docker run command with all the parameters. Hitting enter in this case, you'll see that it responds with a new container ID. So it's essentially a new container. If there was a later version of the Portainer image on the Docker hub, it would have pulled it down and installed that before starting up this new container. But since we don't have an updated version on Docker registry, it's just using the same version. Running docker ps, we see that the container is running with that container ID and all the same parameters as before. Starting up your browser and going into the website, you can see that the login is still there. I have it saved in my browser, so it pre-populated the password, but you can type in the password and log in. Let's log in. Logging in, we see it's the same setup as before. And we know this is the configuration that we used before because the name of the Docker instance is Ubuntu testing, which is what I renamed it to previously with the previous container. So that shows you that it is definitely picking up the Portainer data off that directory. Drilling down, we can see that we get the same setup as before. We have two containers, one running, one stopped. The running one is the Portainer container. And we have 3 images. And clicking on images, we can see that we have images information there. As you can see, and I mentioned before, was doing some testing with this, and I have an Nginx latest image there that's unused. There is no container running that Nginx image, but it is stored on there. So if I was to create a new container that needed Nginx, it would just use that image. Or I can delete that image if I wanted to get rid of that space. And that's it. There's a lot that Portainer can do that's well beyond the scope of this video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see any additional videos on Portainer, but there's plenty of documentation and videos out there on how to use Portainer. So the best method is definitely to dig in and kind of mess around with it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. This is Rick from In Front of IT, signing out.